Okay. I don't want to shame anybody about anything, but if we could bring you to order. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Nicole Kouri, who's a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, to talk to us today on an overview of shame-induced dissociation and its clinical implications. Thank you very much, Nicole.
Hello, everybody. So yes, I'm Nicole Kouri. And first, just thank you so much for having me and organizing this conference. I feel honored and slightly intimidated and anxious, but I'm going to rise to the challenge because I'm quite excited to present my work, which is going to be a look at shame-induced dissociation. And I want to initiate a conversation about some of the clinical implications that I'm seeing about this relationship. First, just to acknowledge the lens through which I approach my work, both as a psychotherapist in training and also as a clinical scientist in training. So I'm an able-bodied, cisgender, female-identifying member of the LGBTQ+ community. I'm also urban dwelling, and I'm a white American. So in terms of learning objectives, what I'm hoping for today is for the audience to be able to identify different dissociative experiences and also discuss the relationship between shame and dissociation that was described in the 2 experimental studies I'll go over, and also describe some clinical implications of this relationship that we're seeing. So we know from extant literature that there is this moderate correlation between shame and dissociation. What we don't see so much is experimental studies that look at a direction between shame and dissociation. And so I was really interested, does experiences of shame result in people dissociating? I also come at this from someone who studies traumatic stress from interpersonal violence. And I'll define all of these terms shortly, but to give some context, interpersonal violence is associated with feelings of shame as well as dissociative experiences, both during the actual violent encounter, but also afterwards. So these feelings of shame and dissociation persist. So what is interpersonal violence? And I'm aware that I'm presenting working definitions, my definitions that I'm working from, so not universal definitions. So interpersonal violence is violence that's committed by a person or a group of people on another person. Now that violence can occur in the home, which has generally been my focus, looking at child maltreatment. So physical, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional abuse and neglect, but it also can occur outside the home. So in neighborhoods, in communities, in schools, identity-based bullying, for example, or just bullying in general. It also can be witnessed. So witnessing domestic violence in the home would be another example of interpersonal violence. Okay, so dissociation. And I want to emphasize that I am studying the consequences of shame. So it's interesting for me to be here with researchers who are studying shame. And so I'm definitely more learned in dissociation than I am in shame. So I'm really presenting methods on how I've studied this relationship between shame and dissociation. But first, defining dissociation. Show of hands if you've driven home, you get home, and you have no memory of how you got there. Okay, so that's dissociation. We all have the capacity to dissociate. There are everyday cognitive failures that we experience. So dissociation is characterized by these alterations or disruptions to normally integrated processes, such as consciousness or perceptions of the environment or perceptions of our bodies, so having out-of-body experiences, or feeling like the world around you isn't real. Like I'm existing in a movie, I'm watching a movie that I'm not a part of. And dissociation works. In the short term, it relieves us from our environment or our internal distress. But in the long term, it can result in real interference with functioning that I'll talk about. In the field of dissociation, there's been arguments back and forth about whether this is a unidimensional construct or a multidimensional construct. But I do want to highlight two different types of dissociation and recognize that there are some diagnoses that you might be familiar with that map onto these two different types. So there's compartmentalization, which would be dissociative amnesia or more extreme dissociative identity disorder. And that's really kind of containing or compartmentalizing different parts of your life. So having blank spaces in terms of different memories that you have. You just have no memory of it. Or for dissociative identity disorder, it would be having separate selves that are disconnected, that you're unaware of when you're embodying a particular self. Detachment, on the other hand, is instead of the disruption to consciousness, you have the alteration to consciousness. So that is the experience of derealization. You are looking at the world as if it's a movie. And then you have depersonalization. So the experience of, I'm not real. I'm a stranger to myself. If I look in the mirror, that's not me. That's this other person. Or my body isn't mine. I'm outside of myself, watching myself. Okay, so in terms of the studies that I'm going to be presenting, the definition that I used, and the reference has been shared in many of the presentations earlier, but shame is a self-evaluative, highly negative emotion that occurs when a person's social status is threatened due to a perceived socio-moral transgression. As someone who studies interpersonal violence, particularly in childhood, I'm also looking at it in terms of not the pro-social results of shame, so someone who seeks out attachment after experiencing shame, but rather shame that is prolonged, that is associated with feeling like I am a bad person, I am worthless, I do not deserve love. And that's what we see in the traumatic stress literature. So shame and traumatic stress have been associated. Both experiencing shame during a traumatic event, but also having a more global sense of shame is associated, and it predicts the onset of post-traumatic stress and also the maintenance of symptoms. And in the second study, I talk about stigmatization. So I want to briefly touch on that now. So this definition is initiated in the child sexual abuse literature. So I want to be clear about how I'm using it. So stigmatization is an affect plus a cognition or an appraisal. So the affect is shame. The cognition or the appraisal is self-blame, and particularly it's taking responsibility for something that you are not responsible for. So a child who has been abused may take responsibility and say, this happened to me because I am bad. A woman who has been assaulted may take responsibility and say, well, I was dressed a certain way. So that is the self-blame, again, taking responsibility for something that is not your fault. And what has been found in the literature, just to highlight this, is this combination of the feeling of shame and the attributional style of self-blame is what is predicting post-traumatic stress. So, like shame, dissociation is associated with traumatic stress. And so much so that the DSM, which in the States is the diagnostic tool that we use, now includes a subtype, a dissociative subtype of PTSD. So someone who has PTSD plus dissociation, the dissociative subtype of PTSD, would have kind of all the markers of traditional post-traumatic stress, so hyperarousal, hypervigilance, negative alterations to cognitions and mood, but they would also experience either depersonalization and derealization. Dissociation can occur during the traumatic event. So in the act of violence, you may feel an out-of-body experience that you're watching it happen, but it also persists after the traumatic event. So when a person is confronted with a reminder, whether it's internal or external, they may experience feelings of depersonalization or derealization. In the neurobiological literature around dissociation, especially traumatic-related dissociation, what you see is a hyperactivation of prefrontal cortex brain regions, and those regions are associated with cognitive control. So there is some evidence to also suggest that where you see the hyperactivation in the interior cingulate cortex, you would also see a dampening of the amygdala and the insula. And so you can think of dissociation as a overcorrection. So I'm going to overmodulate my emotions by dissociating. And I've heard the word avoidance a lot today in terms of avoiding shame. And dissociation is a really good way to avoid. So researchers talk about dissociation as a form of experiential avoidance, or potentially a consequence of experiential avoidance. And so we don't have time to go into that argument, but experiential avoidance is proactive attempts to not engage with reminders of a traumatic event, whether those reminders are internal or external. So I initially started to study dissociation in the context of traumatic stress and interpersonal violence, but I think it's important to highlight that in the same way that dissociation ranges from normative to maladaptive, it also doesn't occur only in the context of traumatic stress. And so it's a transdiagnostic symptom, and it's recently been argued as potentially a mechanism of risk for psychopathology. So you can see dissociation crop up in schizophrenia and psychosis generally, in depression, in panic disorder and OCD as well. There are also substances that are dissociative. So people dissociate in response to traumatic events and reminders of those events, but they also dissociate in response to minor or non-traumatic stressors, such as experiences of shame. So I'm not arguing that shame can't be traumatic, but more saying that there are situations that the levels of shame don't reach the traumatic levels in some cases, and people are still going to dissociate. Okay, and just to add that dissociation has been linked to emotion dysregulation in general. So you'll compartmentalize, you detach from distress, and other strategies, and so this is the action component of that figure that we saw. Other strategies could be rumination, disengagement, suppression. And all of these strategies and dissociation favor short-term relief. I don't want to feel what I'm feeling right now. So I'm going to disconnect, and I'm not going to process what happened. Now, unfortunately, those emotions don't go away. And so that's something else to think about is that the consequence of doing this can be, in some cases, quite severe. Oh, my timer went away, so I might need some, but I'll start with study one. So this study recruited, well, actually, let me first go over the aims of this study. So I touched on how interpersonal violence is associated with feelings of shame and feelings of dissociation. And we have this correlation between shame and dissociation. But I really wanted to see, does shame result in dissociation? We also know from the literature that dissociation has been induced using mirrors. So looking in the mirror for a prolonged period of time can cause someone to feel alienated or estranged from themselves. So I hypothesized that when a person listens to a shame-related memory, autobiographical memory, that they will then report more dissociative experiences. I also hypothesized that when they do so in the presence of a mirror, so they're looking at themselves while they're listening, they're going to dissociate even more. So the paradigm that I used is known as the script-driven imagery paradigm. And this is a paradigm that's well studied, well researched in the traumatic stress literature. So participants traditionally, they're asked to recall the traumatic event that they went through. They write it down and then they record it, or a research assistant will read the script that they've come up with to them. And they're asked to imagine themselves back in that situation. And this was used to study the realities of having gone through trauma and what happens when you're confronted with the memory of it. And so I used a modified version of that, and I'll describe it shortly. Okay, so as I said, the mirror confrontation, this has been used to induce dissociation, both in non-trauma exposed and trauma exposed samples. And so it's looking in the mirror for a prolonged period of time, and people report kind of apparitions or feeling like something's off. I don't recognize this person. And so going to the literature and seeing these two findings, I think begs the question, is it the mirror? Is it how you feel about what you're seeing in the mirror that is inducing dissociative experiences? Okay, so to go over my participants. So 54 female identifying or bodied participants were recruited from an urban area. They were 18 to 30 years old, about 25 years old on average. And most participants identified as women. Most also identified as Black or African American or Hispanic and Latino. And the majority of the sample had an income that fell below the median in New York. That's where the study was taking place. Most had completed some form of higher education. And almost all had reported some form of child maltreatment. I did require that in the eligibility, they had to have experienced some form of interpersonal violence before the age of 17. Okay, so I used a modified version of the script-driven imagery paradigm. And I think really importantly for this conference and for the study is I didn't specify that they needed to recall the traumatic memory. It was any time that they felt shame. It was intentionally open-ended, both temporally, but also conceptually, because I wanted it to be personal. When did you feel shame? And the stories really ranged from traumatic experiences to what was such a beautiful description of seeing a vegetable that had gone bad and what it meant to have wasted this vegetable. So I had the participants recall 2 shame-related memories, and 2 neutral memories. An example of a neutral memory would be going to the grocery store or taking a pet for a walk, for example. And the participants would write down the script. They recorded themselves, so it's about 30 seconds long. And so the way the actual trial works is you're given 30 seconds of silence, then the memory comes on. You listen for 30 seconds, and then you're told to imagine the memory for another 30 seconds, and then there's a recovery. And then I measured shame and dissociation using 2 self-report measures that are validated in the literature. So this is just a visual to show you the 6 different trials. So again, there were 2 different conditions. Either you were listening to a memory in front of a mirror or in front of a black curtain. And within each of those conditions, you had a neutral memory, a shame-related memory, or no memory at all, because I wanted to see the effect of just a mirror or no mirror. And I should say that I ran the study for almost all participants. And so I was in the room, but I had a black curtain, so I was hiding in the corner. But that's also a whole other study of what it means to be in the room while someone's going through this. And there's data around that, but I didn't have time to talk about it. Okay, so if you see here on the graph in the red arrow that's pointing to the middle bar, what this is showing is that shame, regardless of the mirror, is what was resulting in more dissociative experiences. So whether you listen to the shame-related memory in front of a mirror looking at yourself or in front of a black curtain, you reported dissociative experiences afterwards. And now just looking at the 4 memory conditions, or memory trials, excuse me. So what the red circle is highlighting is that they're similar, right? So again, listening to a shame-related memory, regardless of whether it's in front of a mirror or not, resulted in more dissociation, whereas the neutral memories, the ones that aren't circled, right? There wasn't difference between the 2. And there was hardly any dissociation. And going back to this idea that shame is dissociation is a form of avoidance, I then wanted to see what does it do, or is the tendency to avoid the memory, is that what's moderating this relationship between shame and dissociation? So if people are feeling shame and they're feeling it, right? They're processing it, they're not avoiding it. Are they going to experience dissociation? And so what I found was a significant interaction. So only for people who tended to avoid the feelings, those are the participants who reported dissociation. And so on the right-hand side where it says high, right? So they are highly avoidant of the emotions. And the difference between the bars, it's a little far away, so you can't really see it, but just trust me, it was significant, that the difference in dissociation symptoms were significant for those that were avoiding them. So the takeaway from this study is that it provides empirical support for this relationship that shame results in dissociation, but especially for participants who were actively trying to avoid engaging with the memory during the study. So this second study, the first study I should have said has been published, so is available. This second study is part of a larger study and is yet to be published. But the larger study is looking at, there are dynamics that have been identified in interpersonal violence exposure, particularly during childhood, around betrayal. So my caregiver hurt me. I'm betrayed by the person who's supposed to take care of me. I'm powerless against this perpetrator because I depend on them for survival. I'm stigmatized by the experience because I'm told, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it outside the family. So these dynamics appear in interpersonal violence interactions, but also they exist outside of violent interactions. And working with teenagers, I can tell you they definitely exist in going to high school in the US. So what the two principal investigators, what they were interested in is when teenagers who've experienced violence in childhood are confronted with these dynamics in age-typical social situations, how do they respond if it reminds them of things that may have happened in the past? And so to examine this, they created 12 virtual reality simulations of age-typical social stressors. And those stressors were based on focus groups. So all of the scenarios come from teenagers' lived experiences. And so I wanted to, for the purposes of this conference, I focused solely on stigmatization rather than betrayal, powerlessness, and stigmatization. And I predicted that for participants that experienced stigmatization, they were more likely to report experiences of dissociation. I also wanted to control for general distress because the distress model would suggest that any arousal is going to result in someone dissociating. So I wanted to see, is there something unique about feeling stigmatized? So this was quite a large group for me. It felt like a large group of participants, 239 adolescents, 15 to 18 years old, but most of them were around 16 years old. They were recruited from two different cities, Dallas, Texas, and Detroit and the surrounding areas. I also want to emphasize it's a community sample. So we didn't recruit from clinical centers. It's really from high schools and social media. And most participants identified as straight. Most, well, 56% identified as women, and then the second largest group were identifying as men. In terms of the racial makeup of the sample, 34% identified as white, and then the second largest group was Black or African American identifying, and then Hispanic or Latinx. So as I said, that the participants were recruited from the community, and unfortunately they had quite high rates of interpersonal violence. So the green bars are, yes, they had experienced this form of interpersonal violence. So you had conventional crime, maltreatment, which would again be the physical, sexual, emotional abuse and neglect, physical neglect. Peer victimization was very prevalent, which is sadly unsurprising because that does tend to increase at this age, or just interpersonal violence tends to increase during adolescence, I should say. Sexual victimization was 24%, and that was separate to the maltreatment, the sexual abuse that would have been included in maltreatment. And then witness victimization was 56%. The median of the number of types of violence that the adolescents were exposed to was 2, so 2 of the 5. And in terms of the actual events, the median was 4. Okay, so this is just a visual to show you the 12 different simulations that the participants went through. So prior to any virtual reality, they reported their negative emotions and state dissociation. And then after every simulation, they again reported their negative emotions and state dissociation. Here's an example. Oh, it might be a little dark, you can't quite see it, but this is an example of one of the scenes. So it took place at school, in a car, or at a party. And so an example of a scenario would be you find out that you went to a party and your friend who said that they couldn't go was actually there. Or you find out that a friend is spreading rumors about you or sending around a compromising photo. Those would be examples of sadly age-typical situations that students are going through. So in terms of the measures that we used, so they were all self-report. We used the juvenile victimization questionnaire to measure interpersonal violence. For post-traumatic stress symptoms, we used the Los Angeles symptom checklist. The negative emotion was we used the PANIS. And then for stigmatization, we added 5 additional words, which were ashamed, blamed, disgraced, exposed, and judged. And then for state dissociation, this was quite tricky to do because virtual reality is inherently dissociative. You know, asking if you are connected to your body, right? You're not, because you're looking down at a virtual body. So we had to we took from established measures items that we didn't think would be contaminated by the virtual space. So those were having strong feelings that are not my own, mind going blank, feeling spaced out, and in a fog. So all of these items are taken from established measures. Okay, so I'm a quantitative researcher, so I have my results up like this, but I want to break it down. So I ran what's called a two-level or a multi-level model. And to break this down into what this actually means is I wanted to look at how, given how the level of stigmatization someone feels on average, if there is changes to that experience so that they feel more or less stigmatization, are they then going to experience more or less dissociation given their baseline levels of dissociation? So I wasn't testing how did participants compare to each other. So what are the between participant differences? I really wanted to know what within a person is happening. And so what I found was that if we control for victimization history, if we control for post-traumatic stress symptoms, if we control for baseline state dissociation, so did they come in feeling spacey, feeling in a fog, right? If we control for that, and we control for general distress during the virtual reality, so that negative emotion, what we find is that experiencing stigmatization, so experiencing feelings of being ashamed, of feeling exposed or disgraced, that increased state dissociation. Not only that, it interacted with negative emotion. And so it might be hard to see, but generally, as we would expect, negative emotion resulted in more state dissociation because it's a response to distress. But if you look at the second graph, that green line, you'll notice that the slope is steeper. And so for participants that experienced more stigmatization and more increases from their mean levels of stigmatization, that relationship between negative emotion and state dissociation increased. So the takeaway from this study is that stigmatization contributes to state dissociation on top of negative emotion. So it's not just distress, it's also a particular form of distress. And that particular form strengthens this relationship that we're already seeing. I also want to highlight that these situations, they're upsetting. I do therapy with teenagers, and when these happen, I mean, they're catastrophic when they happen, and yet they're every day. And so it doesn't take a whole lot of shame to induce dissociation. I do want to talk about the limitations of the methodologies from both measures. I feel like I have more limitations to add now after the talks from earlier, so I want to bring those in as well. The first is, though, that I did, the studies were, most participants had experienced interpersonal violence, and particularly for study 1, they were required to, right? So I think it's important to look at this relationship in groups of individuals who have not been exposed to trauma to see if the relationship behaves similarly. Additionally, Additionally, all of the measures were via self-report, and now I'm thinking that I did put those emotions in isolation and not in a sentence, so that's something to think about. And I also would like to include behavioral measures as well. So looking at how the body is responding to that situation, and using other methods of shame and to induce shame and dissociation to see if it behaves similarly across methods. I've talked this entire time about how shame results in dissociation, but the reality is that dissociation can be quite shameful. So when you dissociate, especially in a relational context, it can feel really uncomfortable. And from the most recently, actually an article came out showing that when someone dissociates with another person, that they are experiencing shame. And so I think it's a self-reinforcing process that I'm really interested in studying in systems of care. So I just finished work at a methadone clinic, working with a group of people who are so stigmatized. And so I'm wondering about, what does it mean to receive care in a space where you are judged, and to then dissociate because you're feeling judged, because both shame and dissociation really interfere with the therapeutic alliance. And so something that I've really been thinking about is, I don't want my patients to feel ashamed. I don't want them to feel stigmatized. And also, I don't want to be complicit in the avoidance of those feelings, because they have those feelings. And so I think it's on the therapist to kind of not to make space for those emotions. And I think that there's a tendency to distance ourselves from other people who are feeling shame in the therapeutic space and say, don't worry, you don't have to feel ashamed. They're going to feel ashamed. They do feel ashamed. So telling them that they don't need to or they shouldn't isn't actually very effective. So that's what I think about as a clinician. And so I think also, if you're not working as a clinician or working in different capacities, knowing this relationship between, I think there's an echo, knowing this relationship between shame and dissociation can be helpful, especially if your patients have a victimization history. And you might notice someone who's really shut down, unemotional, in a trance. And I think having an awareness of this relationship can tune you into what might be happening. So I just want to thank my collaborators, and most importantly, the participants who shared their stories and engaged in shame and dissociation with me. So thank you.
Super. We've got some time for questions. Back.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I'm not familiar with dissociation, so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that is and the implications of it, please.
So broadly, dissociation is an overmodulation of a response to an emotion. So when we are experiencing some form of distress, we respond to it, whether it's to cognitively reframe it. So at the start of this presentation, I'm really anxious. And so I reframe it and think, this is a challenge. I'm going to rise to the challenge. It's exciting. It's not scary, right? So that would be a form of regulation. I could have, though, completely just blanked and gone up and been like, hi, right? That would also be another response to the distress or the anxiety that I'm feeling. So dissociation is someone, if you ask someone who's dissociating, and what's kind of paradoxical is that they're aware of it. So not with compartmentalization, I'm talking now about detachment, but it's quite distressing to have the experience that the world around me that I am living in, I'm existing in, is not real. It feels unreal. Or I know I'm looking at myself in the mirror. I know it's me, and yet it really doesn't feel like me. It's really alien. So that would be dissociation, and you see it both in non-clinical samples, like you have these everyday cognitive failures, but also clinically, it's really associated with treatment resistance across different diagnoses, because it's really hard to engage in treatment if you're feeling like there's something separating me from this relationship. And also something that I'm quite interested in, and what I study outside of this, is that for people who've experienced childhood victimization, that dissociation is potentially a mechanism of risk for re-victimization in adulthood, because there's such a high rate of re-victimization for people who've experienced violence as children. I hope that answers your question.
Was there a question there or no? Okay, yeah.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I really liked it. And I have a question for you. It's because I'm wondering about it. According to Lazarus, if you have a negative emotion, it's because the self is implicated and you are distancing from a self-relevant goal. From a self-relevant goal. So if you approach a goal, you will have positive emotions. If you distance from a goal, you will have negative emotions. And you measured negative emotions. And did you find out what the goal was that they were moving away from that created their emotions?
Great question. And we do have, so part of this study, I was only presenting one part, but after each simulation, the adolescents were interviewed about what their goals were during that situation. And so those scripts are still being coded. So I don't have data to provide to you now, but yes, we did ask what were they trying to do. I would also be curious, thinking about dissociation as interfering in that process. And also, if you're feeling powerless or like this is inescapable, I wonder if the helplessness would interfere with the goals or even coming up with them.
I might call it there because we're already over time. But thank you very much, Nicole, everybody.